and I'll be presenting on. Hello everyone, and welcome to this virtual side event that is an official part of MENA Climate Week 2022, the first of its kind in the Middle East and North Africa that's part of these regional climate weeks. My name is Mohammed Mahmoud, and I'm the director of the Climate and Water Program at the Middle East Institute. And I'll be presenting on this particular side event topic regarding targeted strategies for MENA-specific climate change implications. As I mentioned, this particular side event is hosted by the Middle East Institute. My talk today is going to be focused on exploring both the impacts of climate change in the Middle East and North Africa, and the areas and impacts I'll be discussing include drought, extreme weather events, wildfires, sea level rise, and most importantly, extreme heat and warming. Because as we are learning from the projections of climate change around the world, and specifically for this region, a lot of these other impacts really are connected and influenced by extreme heat and the amount of warming that this particular region in the world is going to experience. And based on these projected impacts and explaining and understanding how they're going to affect the region, we're going to look at some further actual implications as related to climate change and how these various impacts affect things such as urban population centers in the region, coastal communities in the region, which do include urban population centers, agriculture and agricultural production in the region, and then the water supplies that are part of the region that different nations feed into for their development. And then finally, the impact of climate change on ecological systems, on both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. So before we go into the actual specific impacts that the region is currently facing and expected and projected to face in the both short term and long term, I think we need to understand a little bit more what the climate of the Middle East and North Africa region is. And what you see in front of you is the Köppen climate classification for the MENA region. And right off the bat, you begin to understand that this particular region is predominantly classified as being a warm desert climate. So already this region has a natural propensity to experience hot and dry conditions. As you start to go to maybe some southern extreme portions of the region, as you start to look towards the Sudan, or maybe the most northern parts of the region as you look towards Turkey and Iran, you start to go into some of these other more diverse climate regimes, but predominantly this is a warm desert climate. One of the things about how climate change has evolved over the last few decades, and specifically as we link it with extreme heat, which is one of the main drivers of climate impacts in the region, is that we've seen a shift in the climate, meaning that the climate that we're currently experiencing has increased in terms of average higher temperatures and also increased in terms of variability. And what you end up seeing because of these shifts is expectation of more hotter temperatures, potentially more record type of weather. But at the same time, you also can experience weather extremes on the other side, not just driven by warmer conditions, but also potential shifts for extreme or record cold weather. And the cumulative effect is that really you see both an intensification of global warming as well as the incidence of extreme weather, both on the hot side and on maybe the wet or colder side. And this combination of changes has also caused the region to experience more extreme type heat events. And to really understand how extreme heat is affecting the region, we need to look at more than what we think it is. And for the most part, when we talk about extreme heat, what we tend to focus on is these peak temperature periods, these high temperature periods that tend to occur over the summer in this region and really other parts of the world. But extreme heat is more than that. Extreme heat is more than just breaking records for peak temperature periods in the summer that are significantly above normal. Extreme heat can also translate to longer periods of higher than average temperatures, meaning sustained periods of heat where you may not necessarily break record temperatures, but you have more days where you're closer to that above average threshold of temperatures, and traditionally you'll see this over the summer period. In addition to extreme temperatures that are traditionally occurring during the day, where most of the incoming solar radiation is experienced, you also experience above average nighttime temperatures, which are expected to be somewhat cooler than daytime temperatures. But under extreme heat periods, you also don't tend to experience a reprieve or a significant reprieve from those daytime temperatures, so that drop between daytime and nighttime temperatures isn't as pronounced. Also, one of the impacts of warming is that cooler seasons, non-summer or warm seasons, tend to be even more milder. So cooler seasons will experience a little bit more warmer temperature. And this is sort of the wider impact of global warming. Some of the other complications associated with extreme heat include the fact that cooler regions will relatively get warmer in comparison to regions that are already hot, just for the simple reason that hot and dry regions, a shift in temperature for a region that's already in a particular threshold of higher temperatures, that change doesn't feel as pronounced as regions that tend to be cooler experiencing more jumps in temperature. And I think going back to that classification map, those areas in the southern and northern extreme that are not necessarily warm desert climate, those areas, when we start to see shifts in temperature increases, they're going to experience more relative change that feels more pronounced in terms of higher temperatures than the predominant primary region of the Middle East and North Africa. Another thing that complicates extreme heat or even exacerbates it is the presence of humidity. And we're talking primarily about coastal regions, which there's plenty of in the region that major cities and population centers are placed. These areas that experience high humidity in turn will experience more heat than what the thermometer may actually indicate, because humidity is essentially a heat multiplier. And what people experience when under humidity or humid conditions is the enhanced impact as indicated by the heat index. So from a human perspective, even though thermometer says a particular temperature, what we experience under humid conditions on top of higher temperatures feels a lot more warmer. So one way to understand that is, as I mentioned briefly, the heat index, and this is just an illustration that can show how humidity behaves as a heat multiplier, and this is provided by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or the National Weather Service in the United States. If you look at the chart, on the top part or the top axis is indication of temperature in Fahrenheit, and the example used here is that if the thermometer reads a 96-degree Fahrenheit temperature at successive and increasing levels of relative humidity, that 96-degree Fahrenheit temperature, which would be experienced at let's say a much lower humidity or sort of the lower band of potential relative humidity, as that humidity increases, and you can see the difference going from 40 to 65, the heat that's actually felt increases significantly, such that if we have 65% relative humidity, that 96 degrees Fahrenheit actually feels more like 121 degrees. So it's a significant increase in the exposure to heat because of humidity. And the different gradations in color just indicate what ranges these temperatures could pose in terms of health risks to humans. And we'll talk about heat and extreme heat and public health here in a few moments. But as these colors go darker from yellow to orange to red, these are dangerous, sort of increasing dangerous temperature levels that we experience on top of just the conditions due to the climate, but added on due to humidity. And the Middle East region is not new to this phenomenon. Just last year, over the summer, the region in various multiple places along the region, this is a headline from Al Jazeera, we saw very significant and almost record-breaking high temperatures across different portions of the region, where temperatures recorded were in excess of 50 degrees Celsius, which is phenomenal in all the wrong ways. And so we are certainly looking at potentially shifting into this new regime as we're projected to experience more heat because of climate change in the region, such that potentially sometime in the near future, these extreme temperature ranges could go well into the 50 to 60 degrees Celsius range. So very alarming, to say the least. I just briefly mentioned public health, and so let's talk a little bit more about how extreme heat can pose significant risks and vulnerabilities to populations and how it affects public health. Well, the most direct impact is under extreme heat, being exposed continuously to these types of temperatures, with or without the multiplier of humidity, increases the incidence of heat-related illness. Things like heat stroke, heat exhaustion, and in unfortunate circumstances, death associated with complications of heat illness. And this primarily affects people that tend to be outside or outdoors more, and certainly there's a subset of occupations that have to be working outdoors. And we'll talk about how to reduce their vulnerability later when we talk about some of the adaptation solutions. Because of these sustained periods of extreme heat or high levels of temperatures, there's going to be an increased demand for cooling to offset the public health impact to populations experiencing these levels of high temperatures. That in turn translates to higher energy demand. So that affects a different sector, but is necessary to mitigate the potential of heat-related illness. And then we talked about how humidity acts as a multiplier and intensifies that heat that's experienced by coastal communities, many of which are quite populated in the Middle East, North Africa region. And then one other thing that complicates or behaves as another heat multiplier, primarily in large cities and population centers and urban environments, is this phenomenon we call or refer to as the urban heat island effect, which, as I'll explain, promotes this condition of continuous warming. So what's the urban heat island effect, if you're not familiar? Essentially, when we think about incoming sort of higher temperatures and heat during these peak or warmer, significantly warmer events of extreme heat, that's really driven by areas experiencing more incoming solar radiation. As we said, we tend to see that more during the summer months. And urban environments tend to be almost great areas that great absorbers or retainers of heat. And that's primarily because of how buildings tend to be clustered together that tend to sort of trap ambient heat, but also a lot of urban environments and material tends to be darker in nature. Look at infrastructure and things like asphalt and concrete. And darker surfaces tend to absorb more heat. That's a function of albedo, or essentially reflectivity. So surfaces that have a low albedo tend to have less reflectivity, meaning it absorbs more of that incoming solar radiation. What in turn happens is that heat then is retained in that surfaces versus being reflected out. In addition, when we think of urban environments, we also need to consider emissions. in the sense of vehicles and air conditioning units that, as part of their processes, release and emit warm air. In the case of air conditioning units, it's sort of the cycling of air, drawing in air, cooling it in the internal HVAC environment, and then emitting out warm air as part of that cooling process. And the same thing with emissions as relate to vehicles, operating vehicles, combustion. There's a release of warmer emissions. All of these warm air releases tend to be trapped in this urban environment that creates this bubble or island of warmer conditions. And this tends to create a hotter ambient temperature. The other aspect of urban heat island effect is all of this absorbed heat that tends to occur mostly during the day as more incoming solar radiation is happening. Air conditioners are running during the hot part of the day, which is where the sun is out. And then also think of vehicles going back and forth to work and emitting their particular emissions. All of this warm air, all of this solar radiation that's being absorbed, during nighttime, these surfaces that are absorbing all this heat tend to radiate it outwards. And what in effect happens is you can create this continuous heat bubble where even during nighttime in urban clustered environments like these, there is no reprieve from the daytime heat. Marginally, there is a drop in temperature, of course, but that drop is significantly diminished because of this heat that's been absorbed during the day, radiating out from these buildings and surfaces and infrastructure that creates this heat bubble. There's an impact to infrastructure because of this absorption of solar radiation. We think of infrastructure, we think of critical assets, whether it's bridges, roads, water conveyance infrastructure, power transmission infrastructure, all the critical infrastructure assets that are part of an urban environment. With more heat absorption and incoming solar radiation, this type of infrastructure experiences more wear and tear. In turn, that accelerates the potential for infrastructure failure. There's a higher risk of infrastructure failure because of more wear and tear brought on by these hotter ambient environments. And then finally, that really translates to a reduction in the lifespan of these types of infrastructure. And we'll talk about when we get to the adaptation portion of this presentation, how do we mitigate against these impacts to infrastructure? But these are what we can experience because of more warming and certainly amplified because of the urban heat island effect. The other piece to consider, and we mentioned at the top, is impacts to water resources. And water resources are an important component that sustains development and growth of all communities, both urban and rural. With increased warming and increased temperatures, there also tends to be an increase in evaporation because of more absorbed incoming solar radiation by water bodies and water surfaces. That in turn means when we look at surface water systems or rivers that are, let's say, driven by higher elevation runoff, maybe from accumulation of snowpack that translates into snowmelt during the spring and summer seasons, extreme heat, more evaporation usually means that the snowpack or snowmelt that drives these surface water systems or rivers will be diminished. And so there'll be less snowmelt, less runoff that feeds into these rivers. So that impacts the water quantity of these surface systems, surface water systems. And then when we look at reservoirs that accumulate water in these surface water systems, the multiple dams and reservoirs we have in different regional rivers and tributaries, increased evaporation means there's going to be a reduction in that surface water storage, which then impacts how much water is then released downstream for the different users that rely on it. Shifting a little bit, still within water resources, but more on the application side, is looking at agriculture and agricultural water use and demand. With higher evaporation, that translates to higher evapotranspiration, which is evaporation that's experienced by vegetation and crops. And with that increase, agricultural farming will have a need for more water use. And that's simply because with that uptick in evaporation and evapotranspiration, crops that are being grown on these different farms and agricultural areas will require more irrigation, water to offset that increase in evaporation. So therefore, more water use is needed for the same amount of crops because of this increased warming. And that in turn, not just from the agricultural side, but the reduction in surface water storage and more evaporation experienced by all types of water bodies, puts pressure on nations and communities and municipalities to look for other sources of water, and puts pressure on probably two of the most utilized supplies of water in the region, which is groundwater, where it's available, and then desalination for communities that only have really access to groundwater and have no access or limited access to surface water supplies. So when we think of extreme heat and warming as really one of the main drivers of climate change impacts in the MENA region, there is a cost associated with it. And it's a cost that can be understood in a number of ways. Ultimately, it will be expensive to address issues related to extreme heat and warming in the region as we explore and look for mitigation and adaptation strategies. But ultimately, preventative and adaptive costs that mitigate or address or deal with impacts of warming, significant warming and extreme heat, are still a cheaper expenditure than the costs associated with crisis management and recovery if we don't prevent some of these impacts from or mitigate against some of these impacts occurring, especially when we talk about public health. Lives are not recoverable. That's an unrecoverable resource. So one of the costs of extreme heat is this higher incidence of heat-related illness and death. And there are headlines that indicate that in the region. This particular headline indicated that Egypt heat wave has left 61 people dead. Similarly, when we talk about infrastructure, asset failure and accidents also lead to unfortunate fatalities and higher costs of recovery for those infrastructure as opposed to conducting maintenance and repairs. Another headline indicates how in Beirut, that particular heat wave, experienced in Beirut has led to significant power failures and environmental waste issues. And then finally, water resources, a critical component of development and economic growth for any nation. Headlines have indicated that Middle East could face water shortages for the next 25 years because of rising populations and dwindling water supplies. And the interesting thing is these headlines, and you see the sources there from the BBC and the Guardian, this isn't headlines that have occurred this year or even last year. These things have been happening and have been noted as been happening as far back, these particular headlines, as August 2015 and even further back. So the idea is that these impacts associated with extreme heat aren't going to happen. They are happening and they've been happening. So the need for action is in the present. It's not something that we're waiting to occur. We are experiencing these impacts in the region as we speak. One of the other things to consider when it comes to warming is not just its impact on land surface, but how it drives a number of other issues as it relates to the warming of the oceans. As you all are aware, most of the Earth is covered by water. And so the oceans behave in a number of ways that help to regulate global temperatures and move heat across the world via ocean, either deep water currents or surface wind-driven transitions. But one of the most direct impacts of warmer oceans and waters and seas is how it impacts marine life and ecosystems. Warmer waters tend to be a prime condition that supports algae growth and potentially algae blooms. And with the expansion of algae, there comes a depletion of dissolved oxygen in the water. And that has a very direct consequence to ecological and marine species that are dependent on sufficient dissolved oxygen in the water for them to maintain life. Degradation of ecosystems because of warmer water, turbidity. Example I use here is the corals that exist in a lot of the water bodies that surround the Middle East and North Africa, whether it's in the Red Sea, the Gulf, or even the Mediterranean. And then with warmer waters, you impact actual fish populations or marine life, once again, either through algae growth or just warmer waters, because certain types of fish cannot spawn or procreate unless waters are in a particular temperature threshold. And with warmer waters comes the risk of this reduction of fisheries and fish production and productivity as they're impacted by significantly warmer temperatures. When we also think about impacts as related to warming of the oceans, two things to really consider is sea level rise, and somewhat connected to that is, or to the oceans, warming of the oceans is extreme weather. Sea level rise presents encroachment on coastal communities with warmer waters and sort of expansion of the volume of oceans. Essentially, that encroachment on land could be an issue as it potentially affects coastal urban communities that are along the coastline, as well as potential agricultural areas. And I think of the Nile River Delta in Egypt on the Mediterranean as being a prime example of very productive agricultural area that could be impacted. And then in other regions where there's critical infrastructure, such as water treatment plants or desalination plants that tend to be along the coast, sea level rise could threaten the stability and viability of those infrastructure, as they could potentially now be inundated or submerged. So that requires a huge relocation efforts in order to move both populations, agricultural productive areas, critical infrastructure out of the potential range of coastal areas that could be impacted with future sea level rise. When you think of sea level rise, one of the things that makes this impact more severe, especially for agricultural areas, is this higher incidence of wildfires. And some of the projections indicate more wildfires occurring primarily in the the coastal band around the Mediterranean, both in North Africa and the Middle East around the Mediterranean. And so with that incidence of higher wildfires coupled with sea level rise, creates more vulnerable conditions for these agricultural areas, and potentially then in fact starts to impact the food production sector. And that has multiple cascading effects if impacted. And so these areas that are prone to wildfires are going to continue to experience more hot and dry conditions that boost the probability of wildfires occurring. And then extreme weather events, there's multiple ways we look at extreme weather events. I think the one that's most directly associated with warming of the oceans is what we see potentially happening in the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea. Warmer waters or warmer sea surface temperatures tend to be a great hotbed for producing cyclones. And we've seen this in the last few years. Certainly last year, a significant cyclone was generated from the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea that made landfall in Oman, Cyclone Shaheen, which had some very devastating damages and losses of both infrastructure and lives. And so with more warmer waters, with higher sea surface temperatures, there will be a probability of more intense and frequent tropical cyclones forming in the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, and not just forming, but also making landfall to devastating effect. Other types of extreme weather events to consider is, as we talked in the beginning, how climate is shifting. And so there's this potential for, even though areas would be continuing to experience drought, can also at the same time tend to experience extreme and heavy precipitation events during these long periods of drought, these short and intense types of thunderstorm and precipitation events. And the Sahara region, North Africa, is one of those areas where that is expected to occur, potentially with more frequency. So you have this very interesting coupling of both drought conditions and potential short, intense precipitation events that could still also lead to flooding. So it's a very, very complex scenario and combination of outcomes. So let's talk a little bit more about, so we talked about the impacts. Let's address what are some of the strategies that target some of these impacts more specifically. And we'll look on both the adaptation side, and with respect to adaptation strategies, I'll be focusing more on strategies that address impacts to water supply, impacts to agriculture, and impacts that are an outcome of extreme heat. And then when we talk about mitigation strategies, which is the other piece of the response, we'll look at things that are more aligned with the energy sector. So things associated with carbon emission reductions and diversification of energy portfolios. And when it comes to mitigation and these more energy aligned strategies, I'll focus more on the climate related impact. There are folks that are much more knowledgeable and seasoned than me on drivers of energy use and how it lumps with the economy and so forth. So I won't be looking at it from that perspective, but just looking at it in terms of mitigation strategies to address climate change. So with adaptation, the first area to look at, which is of significance, is water supply, as it is really a driver of economic growth and development. And when it comes to water supply, there are a number of strategies that are either available or could be implemented if they haven't been widely implemented, certainly in the MENA region, but have been implemented in other parts of the world. And one strategy that comes to mind that I consider as a water augmentation strategy is what we refer to as weather modification, or more specifically, cloud seeding, which is essentially the application or practice of introducing particular material, chemicals into the atmosphere that then behave as water vapor attractors to lump water vapor in the atmosphere as a way to encourage or to produce precipitation. If this is being applied in the MENA region, this would be directly a warm weather precipitation type of application for cloud seeding. And in fact, cloud seeding as a science, as a practice, has been around for over 70 years in many different parts of the world, the United States, India, but also within the Middle East. Israel has had some applications, and even here in the United Arab Emirates, we've seen, some of you may have seen the videos that from earlier this year or last year that showed sort of an outcome of a cloud seeding activities that produced more precipitation. Cloud seeding tends to be somewhat of a more conditional application, for the reason being that cloud seeding to produce precipitation requires certain conditions to be present. It's not just as simple as releasing these types of material or chemicals that interact in the atmosphere to attract more water vapor and produce precipitation. There are thresholds that need to be met with respect to temperature, conditions, storms that may be moving into the region. Cloud seeding to produce precipitation tends to behave or used as a multiplier of existing precipitation. The idea usually is to encourage existing storms that are meant to produce precipitation or conditions that could produce precipitation to increase or enhance the level of rain or precipitation that could occur. So generally speaking, and this is just a generalization, this application doesn't generally produce precipitation for an area that does not have significant conditions, maybe in line with water vapor, sufficient water vapor, or storm movement that would have produced precipitation anyhow. The other thing to think about that's potentially a water augmentation strategy, but more of a water recycling strategy, is looking at urban water reuse in a different way. A lot of places in the world consider urban water reuse or water recycling as taking water that has been utilized. One of the examples is taking wastewater, treating it to non-potable uses, meaning that treating that wastewater or used water to a standard where it can be applied to public green areas, parks, lawns, potentially on irrigation as a way to boost agriculture, but not necessarily treating it all the way through so that it's suitable for potable uses, meaning suitable to be used as drinking water. This type of water reuse does exist in different parts of the world. The processes are not that different from the standards or treatment processes used to take non-potable, but not necessarily wastewater, and treat it to drinking water standards. So water that you get from groundwater or desalination or surface water systems and rivers. It's taking that extra step from that wastewater to non-potable water quality all the way down to drinking water quality. And in a way, the benefit of doing that is amplifying the use or viability of a water resource more than one time, right? So you get your supply source from whether it's groundwater, surface water, or desalination, and after a particular use, whether it ends up as wastewater or some other type of used water, applying the treatment processes to then also generate drinking water again. So as we think about more drought in the future for the regions, we think about water scarcity and challenges that diminish the available water supply for the different countries in the MENA region. This is one way to stretch the existing water supply and water resources more. And it would be one of the ways, I think one of the recommendations to improve or enhance the region's water resource viability. Another thing to look at from an adaptation standpoint is how technology can play a role to improve the ability to augment water supply. So desalination is a water augmentation strategy because you are introducing new water into your system that's primarily being from ocean water or seawater that is more saline. And there are potentially ways to increase the amount of water that's being extracted from that process, either by utilizing less energy. Desalination is a very energy intensive operation. There are technologies that are being developed to improve the energy efficiency of that operation, as well as to improve the process of brine extraction, essentially the salt matter that needs to be removed for that water to be suitable for potable use. Primarily, a lot of the desalination technologies utilize reverse osmosis, but there is even studies and development in technology that improves the reverse osmosis process to potentially make the technology more efficient, not just in terms of energy use, but also in terms of water that's produced. And then all of these technologies or applications, whether it's improved desalination, urban water reuse to drinking water standard, or even utilization of weather modification, all of these together, this new water supply that's being introduced through these applications could then be used to support and reduce the pressure of these other diminished natural supply sources. And really the two I think about, or the one really I think about, is groundwater aquifers. In a lot of the regions in the Middle East and North Africa, there is not a lot of natural precipitation. And so as these underground groundwater aquifers are tapped and utilized as a supply source, there is no natural or significant natural ways for them to be recharged. And so looking at these other sources of water augmentation as a way to introduce more water into these aquifers to help artificially recharge them more could beef up and improve the potential use and lifespan of that diminished or non-renewable, really, water supply. Connected again to water supply is agriculture. And a lot of the adaptations that improve agriculture's resilience against climate change impacts has to do with how agriculture and irrigation practices are conducted in general, but specifically in this case in the region. And what are some of these applications or technologies that we can either put to place if they're not active in different regions and countries in the Middle East and North Africa, but also expanding their use and application as a way to improve water use efficiency. I think one of the simplest ways is really looking at how irrigation methods are used in different agricultural districts in the region. Are different farms still using flood irrigation, which is absolutely water inefficient, versus more measured drip irrigation techniques? The timing of irrigation, is it done during the hottest part of the day, which enhances the evaporation, therefore increases water irrigation requirements? Or is it done maybe in cooler, relatively cooler parts of the day that experiences less evaporation? So there's simple changes that can happen on the irrigation techniques and methods that don't require large investment and potentially time and cost. For the same amount of water supply, I think the incentive and motivation there for agricultural districts that maybe have some more inefficient practices is that for that same amount of water, they could irrigate more lands. And that should be hopefully incentive enough for them to try to shift some of their irrigation methods if they're truly inefficient from a water use perspective. There are improvements, and if they are very much using drip irrigation, which tends to be the most water efficient application, there are improvements and advancements in drip irrigation technology that improve an already quite efficient water type application. There is technology currently out of Israel called NDrip that follows this approach of how do you maximize existing drip irrigation practices so that you use exactly the amount of water needed to grow the type of crops you grow while minimizing the types of losses from the water application method. And then there are other practices that more associated with how agricultural farms or irrigation districts grow their particular crops. Do they rotate their crops and fields in a way that makes the most out of their fields while also utilizing appropriate amounts of water? Are they growing more water intensive crops, and is there a way for them to shift to different types of crops that are maybe less water intensive but still meet either the demand on the types of crops that are needed in that region or country, or that still provide them with the same level of revenue that's needed for them to continue operating their farms? And then exploration of maybe more native crops and species versus those that are not native to the particular land or geology or geography where these farms are situated. Generally speaking, native species, because Middle East, North Africa, as we said, tends to be more of a hotter and drier climate, these types of native crops may not use or require as much water versus some of these crops that are not native to this part of the world, and therefore will have higher irrigation requirements. And then finally, and this is really potentially a big one, but does have could have a high cost associated with it, is improving the water conveyance systems that are used in different farms and agricultural districts in terms of delivering water to irrigate their different crops. Some of these systems or conveyance structures could be old, and so there could be a lot of water leakage, water loss, maybe more evaporation if it's a large open surface water conveyance system. Are there ways to reduce that water loss of conveyance by improving and updating those water conveyance systems? And I think that is one of the significant ways to reduce water loss. And essentially, once again, when we look at adaptation, when it comes to something like agriculture, is how do you make that same amount of water that these agricultural districts receive go further? essentially. And that's a way to mitigate, or I should say adapt, against the drought implications of climate change. Going back to extreme heat, which is, as I mentioned, really one of the drivers of many impacts for the Middle East and North Africa. We talked about public health and some of the impacts to public health and heat-related illnesses. We must recognize, as temperatures continue to rise, that there has to be an adequate and sustained cooling environments for all these urban populations and urban city centers that tend to experience more heat, especially if they're also coastal communities, and many of them are, such as where the Regional Climate Week, at least the North Africa Regional Climate Week, is taking place here in Dubai. One of the things to consider for outdoor workers or parts of our populations that have to be working outdoors or be present outdoors for long periods is exploring more adaptation measures on how they conduct their work. Looking at adjusted work schedules, things such as if there are hotter days coming where these workers need to be outside, can some of that work be shifted to nighttime? Think of things like construction. Can they be shifted to nighttime as opposed to daytime? Can particular workers under these sort of external outdoor conditions, can they shift their work schedule? Can they start earlier or potentially later, once again, shifting into nighttime? Or take midday breaks or late afternoon breaks during the period of the day where the hottest temperatures tend to be experienced. So there are potential ways to adjust how work is done for these outdoor and external workers. And then also to support workers that are operating under these very extreme heat conditions is looking at different types of cooling technologies and applications. And these exist in some form or fashion, and technologies continue to develop to improve them. Things such as cooling vests that maintain lower body temperatures while being exposed to these conditions, enforcing as part of the work schedule mandatory work breaks at certain segments or increments throughout the days, introduction of cooling centers where if there is an issue of someone experiencing some type of heat-related fatigue, they can excuse themselves and sort of make way to these cooling centers where they're able to recover and to prevent even further complications associated with heat illness. And then, much like parts of the world where they have high probability fire days, maybe instituting something as high extreme heat days, where it's essentially these are mandatory days off when the region or countries or sectors experience or are projected to experience significant peak temperature days where it is absolutely dangerous to be outside for a prolonged period of time. Looking at infrastructure and how that sector can adapt with respect to implications of extreme heat, we talked about the higher incidence of wear and tear and potential failure and reduction of lifespans. Well, to mitigate or to adapt against that, we need to look at the sector needs to explore and institute more frequent safety and inspections to assess the health and quality of these types of infrastructure that then in turn can inform on how often and when should maintenance be done to proactively prevent potential failure or significant reduction of lifespans. And in turn, with these more frequent inspections, assessments can be made on the types and frequency of maintenance projects that are required to minimize the impact of extreme heat on infrastructure. So inspections give you an indication of what is the damage that's been done or potential damage that can be done in terms of lifespan and viability of these physical assets. And then the maintenance projects are a way to counter against that, to be able to repair some of those damages that could be experienced on this type of infrastructure. And then finally, larger scale construction projects can also be done. So it's not just as simple as routine maintenance that's done more frequently, but also looking at larger scale construction projects that can actually extend the lifespan of existing infrastructure systems if the impacts of extreme heat continue to be more consequential. Shifting to the mitigation side of things, and like I said, these are more energy driven, and primarily we're looking at carbon emissions and energy. Once again, just looking at it from a climate mitigation perspective, not going into the nuances of the energy industry and the economy associated with that, but looking at carbon emission reduction and the mitigation solutions that I'm proposing here are really technology driven. One of the ways is to look at increasing carbon capture. There are potential improvements in fossil fuel energy production that could reduce the amount of carbon emissions released as part of the process. Some of the things that have been proposed over the last year or the last few months include this concept of a circular carbon economy that's been put forth by Saudi Arabia. Those are interesting ideas, and obviously we need to see more sort of fleshing out of those concepts, but that's a step, and potentially a step in the right direction. On the other side of things beyond just carbon capture, we're looking at introducing more carbon sinks. There are natural carbon sinks in the environment. The oceans tend to behave as a large source of carbon sinks, and then vegetation, large amounts of vegetation tend to behave as carbon sinks as they absorb carbon and release oxygen, carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Looking at reforestation or growing of large vegetation as a way to mitigate against more carbon being released in the atmosphere, or looking at injecting some of that carbon that's produced geologically. So looking at geological storage as a way to remove some of that carbon or the emission of that carbon into the atmosphere. On the energy side, looking at potentially having a more diverse energy portfolio that shifts the region more from fossil fuel energy, which obviously is more carbon emittive, is how do you diversify the region's energy portfolio, and certainly for different countries, so that they have a more balanced energy production portfolio that isn't as fossil fuel heavy or shifts the carbon emission production that is driven by fossil fuel industry. Obviously, the big thing that's always been talked about is how do you shift more towards renewables? Obviously, wind power being one of them, but I think the one that is far more promising for the Middle East, North Africa region is solar. Just because of the natural conditions of this region of the world, there is huge potential to capitalize on solar energy production as a growing sector for energy production and use. It's kind of moved towards a lower cost as far as implementation, but also looking at different parts of the region, there is significant land that's available. Certainly when you start looking at areas like the Arabian Peninsula, large amount of available land to construct significantly sized or sizable solar farms. And because we're in this part of the world that is experiencing more solar radiation and more extreme heat, there is also a higher potential to absorb and generate more solar energy. The issue has always been when it comes to renewables is, and certainly specifically in this case, also just talking about solar, is the issue of energy storage and scale. There has been technologies that have improved the ability to store some of this generated energy from renewables, but the issue is how do you increase the amount of energy that can be stored at a higher scale because of trying to increase the size of these potential solar farms that then in turn could produce and store large amounts of energy. I think that is an area of technological improvement that is ongoing. And I believe we'll get to a point where we can address that issue. That's primarily, in my opinion, one of the biggest obstacles right now that prevents renewables from being more largely incorporated as part of the energy portfolio of different countries in the region. Obviously, besides cost and potential existing infrastructure of other types of energy production. And then looking at maybe shifting towards what I referred to as intermediate or more transitional green energy. So not necessarily renewables, but almost a step in between from fossil fuels to renewables, which is looking at energy sources such as natural gas and nuclear energy production. So somewhat cleaner than fossil fuel, but obviously not traditionally viewed as renewable energy sources. But those are different types of energy sources that could be incorporated to diversify the energy portfolio of different countries in the region as a way to potentially move towards renewables, shift slightly off or shift off of fossil fuels, or shift largely off of fossil fuels, while also looking at ways to reduce the carbon emission factors associated with fossil fuel energy production. So that's sort of my kind of view on summarizing the issues associated with the types of impacts that the region will experience and different types of climate change implications, and then really just broadly exploring some of the targeted solutions that could be put in place in response, both on the adaptation side and on the mitigation side. So some of my final thoughts that kind of wrap where we go from here in the region is really understanding that, hopefully it's been made clear through my presentation, is that the consequences of delayed and inadequate action against climate change in the MENA region are very much dangerous. And we've walked through some of those examples because we've seen how they translate to more vulnerability with respect to this region's future climate. And then one of the things that I want to make sure is not forgotten is that because this region already experiences hot and dry conditions as part of its long natural environment, in a way, the MENA region is already prepared. I won't say prepared, but is already equipped to begin to address these issues because this is not a new development. They should be prepared for action. The MENA region should be prepared for action because of their existing vulnerability to climate-related issues and challenges. So there's an opportunity to capitalize on that head start. There are already mechanisms in place. There are already technologies and institutions in place that address some of these climate change impacts. It's not necessarily doing something new, but expanding on what already exists. And then just to add to the sense of urgency, whether it's governments, public, private sectors, or different communities, municipalities in the region, hopefully need to understand that they need to accelerate their action against climate change in terms of potential mitigation and adaptation strategies that they can apply at their local level before these types of climate impacts truly become unmanageable. And some of the studies, certainly thinking about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6 assessment reports, have really indicated that even if we as a region are able to fully implement all the mitigation and adaptation strategies possible tomorrow, some of these impacts will not diminish for a significant amount period in the future, decades, and in some cases, such as with sea level rise, centuries. So there really is no time to delay looking at serious options that can mitigate and adapt against these climate change implications. So with that in mind, also recognize that as I mentioned just briefly earlier, adaptation and mitigation solutions do exist, whether they're already in place in the MENA region or maybe at a smaller scale. There are also going to be new technologies and applications that continue to be developed that could be applied in this region to address some of these implications we talked about. Opportunities to implement these new technologies or to expand existing solutions on the adaptation mitigation side should absolutely be explored and evaluated as they continue to come online, as they become viable, to really start to sort of propel and speed up the action and response. And then finally, just more of a general message, really, that we need to continue to fully mainstream climate adaptation mitigation at all levels, whether regional, national, local, for our region, the MENA region, to manage these expanding influence of climate change and how it connects to all the different sectors and all the types of impacts and effects that it propagates, as we've discussed today. Finally, I just wanted to add that this work has been presented to you as part of the Middle East Institute's Climate and Water Program, of which I'm a part of, and as I've mentioned in the top end, the director of it. Relatively new program that started off end of last year, September of last year. And we really are focused on these types of issues, understanding how climate change impacts the region in terms of the environment, water resources, and other aspects that are connected to climate change, and exploring ways where the region can increase its climate resilience through different adaptation and mitigation practices. And one of the things that actually is coming up is we're starting a series on innovations in climate resilience. That's very much in line with the topic we discussed today. And we're planning tentatively our first session of that series to occur on Earth Day 2022. I encourage you to subscribe to the mailing list at MEI to receive notification once that event has been confirmed. And then if you have any questions, do not hesitate to email me directly. My email is right there. I'd be more than happy to follow up. And thank you very much for your attendance. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the MENA Climate Week event.